slide. And so what I've decided to do is really make this more conversational and hopefully a little more interactive that way. I don't, Giselle will cut me off when we run out of time, but I just want to talk about three main um, projects that I have been working on, that the center has been working on, that USC has been working on, that's related to the military, and then just really open it up for questions and comments from those who have logged on. So one, I just want to welcome everyone. I want to thank Giselle and Eva for setting all of this up and making this about as painless and as seamless as possible. So thank you, Giselle and Eva, for all your hard work on that. So I'm going to talk about, I think Giselle sent around a paper that a lot of folks who are in the veteran space, who are in the military space, felt the need to sort of write a paper to talk about potential impact that the COVID pandemic could have on veterans and their families. And so I'm not going to belabor that paper. You have it, you can look at it. But one of the things we are trying to do as a community, as a national community, as an international community, is really highlight all of those things and all of the lessons learned and all of our experiences from serving in the military and what that can bring to addressing the current pandemic. And I think we all know there are a lot of things that we can do, the importance of leadership, the importance of when you have poor leadership, what that can do to morale and how that erodes cohesion and can lead to bad behaviors, all of the things that we know happen in the military. I think we can see across the nation and literally across the world playing out in different forms. And so we're trying to draw on what are those lessons learned about how military approaches things and how can that be applied to the current pandemic. So you saw the one paper that Giselle sent around. We're working on a variety of other papers as well. So that's one thing that I have been working on personally, and hopefully if folks have any ideas, please email them to me or send them to me, and would love to include them and flesh them out in more detail. Another thing we're also looking at is for a lot of veterans, they were receiving their care by coming into clinics, behavioral health care, physical health care, and a lot of that is moved to remote care and services provision. And so we have an active study going on looking at how that transition is going, how are clinicians viewing the transition, how are the veterans and their families viewing the transition, and what can we do better to support our veterans and families who are receiving care remotely. And we think that's really, really important to capture sort of the lessons learned in this whole transition. So, as an example, the Cohen Veteran Network, and I know many of you are familiar with that network, they used to have a clinic in LA that they since closed, but they have over 20 clinics now around the US. And before the pandemic began, about 7% of all of the veterans that they were seeing, which is around between 3,000 and 5,000 at any point in time, about 7% of them were receiving their care remotely via telehealth. Within 2 weeks, the entire Cohen Veterans Network moved to remote care and services provision, which is just unprecedented. So so all of the obstacles, that were put in place or that people thought existed that prevented a wider adoption of telehealth is now happening. And so I think that's the good news of kind of in a really bad, dire situation. There's some positive things, I think, that are coming out of this. And I think that is sort of a wider adoption of telehealth and the appropriateness of using telehealth. So we are looking at that to really maintain the momentum of this shift to receiving care remotely, and for not just veterans, but also for their family members, and not just and to include active duty as well. So that's one of an effort that I'm involved in. And I'm also involved in several active duty studies, but just one in particular. We are looking at suicide. So this is the next topic I want to talk about is veteran suicide and veteran risk to veterans and their families as a result of the pandemic. But it's not really the pandemic and the COVID that we're focused on. So we know, for example, during times of recession and economic downturns, that broadly across the U.S., across the world, you see this increase in depression, domestic violence, substance use, abuse, and suicides. And so we are trying to understand and make some projections about the demand that we are going to see on all of the services, but in particular, we're focusing on veteran services. What is that increase in demand going to look like during this really economic implosion, right? If, the rates are 20, 30, approaching 20% unemployment, if they go higher, because we know that has huge effects on people's ability to give, to support nonprofit organizations, but it also has a huge impact on veterans who are losing their jobs. And some of the data that has come out of the Bureau of Labor and Statistics has shown that younger veterans in particular, are disproportionately being impacted by the economic downturn due to the pandemic. So we're looking at that in a very, very serious way and really thinking, okay, what can we do? What's the need going to be? Because what we don't want to have happen is, that the veteran support, network that we have built up over the last decade plus collapses on itself or it's unable to meet the rising demand. But in particular, we're really focusing on getting ahead of the suicide curve that we know is going to happen in these big economic downturns. They've happened every time we have one, and we're really, really monitoring that very, very carefully. And we want to try to do what we can to get out front of all of those negative outcomes, if you will. And I know I've kind of focused on the negative, and that's because I want to prevent the negative, but there's also been some wonderful, wonderful success stories as well. I think the movement of telehealth and veterans rallying to support each other, there's lots and lots of examples of that. And we want to build on that and keep that going as well. So I'm going to stop there. There are lots of other things I'm doing as well, and that the center is doing, and that Dr. Kinsel's doing, and that Hazel O'Toole's doing, and other folks are doing at USC and within our center and around the nation and around the world. But I'm going to stop there because I could take up all the time, and then we wouldn't really have this sort of discussion, question and answer that I really think is important during this time. So I'm going to stop there. And I don't know how, Giselle, we will do questions and answers, but I'm going to turn it over to you and to facilitate that.
Right, so there's a small chat box. You can see that. Click on there and go ahead and type in your answer, and we'll go ahead and read that out loud. Carl, if you click on it, you'll see the questions. You can answer live, or you can type in your answer.
Okay, so I don't know if this is the first question or not. This is the first question I'm seeing, so I'm just going to read the question. Is that right, Giselle, and then answer it for those of you who aren't online? So the first question is, in going to telehealth, how much of a tech gap are we seeing? No laptop or notebook, no training to use software for older vets. Tom O'Shaughnessy, I guess, Tom, that was your question. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to read out the person who typed in the question. So yes, there is a tech gap. There is a tech gap. And one of the things that I think we need to think about, most of the time when we say telehealth, people are thinking what we're doing right here with video and audio and PowerPoint slides. But I will tell you, there is a very solid, I won't say robust, but I'll say a solid scientific base that that therapy specifically and services delivered over the telephone are just as effective as Zoom or Skype or other types of audiovisual. I know that, there's this insurance, issue about reimbursements and all of that, but I think we just need to be very, and most people do have telephones. So services can be provided over the telephone as well. And actually therapy can be provided over the telephone. I remind folks that the main intervention we have for stopping veterans and all Americans who are in a suicidal state is what? The telephone. It's a call-in number, and that's an intervention, and it's very effective. So when people say, oh, well, you need to have a laptop computer and I need to see you, for sure, that's better than a telephone, but a telephone can be very effective. So I hope that began addressing that question. But I do think one of the things we will have to be thinking about, instead of investing in brick and mortar, we're going to need to be investing in connectivity and Wi-Fi and all of those capabilities. And then we have the next question is, disaster brings back all the effects of childhood trauma. It does, yes. So if you have trauma, even trauma that's been addressed and you think resolved, things can come back up as new traumas appear. That's absolutely correct. And then there's this quote here about the percent of people who come into the military with trauma. Yeah, I mean, I think that's representative of American life, really world. I mean, trauma is a very, 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 very prevalent experience that a lot of us have. And whether it's an early childhood or early adulthood or military service or post-military service, I mean, trauma is a part of most cultures that really is not, I don't think, well recognized, the extent and the breadth of trauma and the impact that it can have. Thank you for that comment, though. Reminds us that we're not all starting in the same place. Some people are starting in different places, and really we're talking about vulnerabilities there. Okay, the next one, I don't see a question there. Giselle, if I'm missing any of these questions, please just let me know.
Carl, I actually have a few that are popping up in Q&A, and I'll read the first one for you.
Okay, thank you, Giselle. I don't want to miss anyone, even accidentally.
So this is how would you define the technological gap? For example, is it attitudinal, knowledge, access, etc.?
That's a great question. And I've not seen any really, I can only give you anecdotally. And I hope I don't offend anyone, but I think the main gap in people adopting technology is from the provider perspective. And I hate saying that because that includes me in that group. Providers come up with lots of reasons why telehealth will not work for their clients, and why they won't do it and why they won't adopt it, and et cetera, et cetera. But what we're seeing, at least in the Cohen Veteran Network, it's being widely adopted. And even every single provider in the Cohen Veteran Network, every single provider moved to telehealth. Now, I think the alternative is, well, you don't have a job. So keeping your job is a real good forcing function for providers to move to telehealth. And then there are veterans. I think it's a small minority of veterans, but from this study we're doing, I'll be able to give you a real number, hopefully in the next several months. There probably is a real number that veterans do not want to engage in services or care via telehealth. And there's no question that there's going to be some who would rather not do that. And what we need to do is work with them to make them, address their concerns they have, which are all legitimate. And because this is probably the main way moving forward, I think that a lot of telehealth or a lot of services will be provided. you know, there's a colleague of ours that's also working on this project, Dr. Dorian Traub. Many of you may know her. Her whole thing is trying to deliver services to families with children via telehealth. And nobody wanted to do that. And her whole early career for the last 10 years of her career was trying to get people to embrace telehealth, because if you think of
Carl, your sound, you're freezing. From a family perspective, if you have children. Hello, am I back? Yes.
Sorry about that. It's,
Okay, good. It was scary.
this is part of the technology glitches that we need to beef up. So I don't know where I cut out at, but I think there are obstacles, but I think all the obstacles that we have, we can overcome them. Let me just stop there.
Okay, I have another question here. Recognizing the challenges we're facing, where in the nation we're seeing the best examples of comprehensive support for veterans, what are the lessons we can be learning from those communities? What are we missing here in Los Angeles? This is from Stephanie Stone.
Well, you know, so there was the first part of the question was what was the part about the comprehensiveness, Giselle? I want to make sure I understood the question.
It says, recognizing the challenges we're facing, where in the nation we're seeing the best examples of comprehensive support for veterans. What are the lessons we can be learning from those communities? And what are we missing here in Los Angeles?
Well, I mean, so I think that Los Angeles is unique and special in the veteran space because of the collaborative, right? And I don't think there's another group like the Los Angeles Veterans Collaborative where you have the breadth and commitment of people coming together and working together and sharing ideas. And I think that's a model that all communities can use, from 3 or 4 groups to hundreds of organizations coming together. And I still, you know, there's still this reluctance of funders to fund collaboratives of this type because it's not providing direct services to veterans and their families, right? And that's what a lot of nonprofits want to focus on. Well, how many veterans are you helping? But you have to have an infrastructure of the sharing of the ideas, like the Los Angeles Veterans Collaborative that we have here, to enhance all those other pieces, to make sure there aren't these gaps. And generally what society does outside of the veteran space is, here's a problem, you throw resources on it, oh, here's another. It becomes a whack-a-mole type of approach, as opposed to having a collaborative who's already thinking holistically, comprehensively, to cover down on issues before they emerge and become emergencies. So, I mean, I think that the Los Angeles Veteran Collaborative is a model for a lot of things. And one of the things I didn't mention, I'm also involved in the president's Prevent effort to end veteran suicides. And specifically, it's focused on preventing veteran suicides. And they literally talk about, as one of the main ways of addressing veteran suicide, is through a veteran collaborative. One would almost think that the person who wrote that in the plan knew about the Los Angeles Veterans Collaborative. It almost described us to a T. And so I think it's being recognized at the national level that the way to address veteran suicide is not by going around asking every veteran, hey, are you suicidal? But by engaging all of the providers who touch veterans, who can spot the risk factors that are present and then begin addressing those so it's not this downstream approach, but this upstream approach. So I hope that answered your question. I tried to give a concrete example of where I think that's playing out at the national level in the president's initiative to end veteran suicides. Giselle, you still there?
Yes.
Carl, this is Eva. I'm going to read another one.
Okay.
This is from Lewis South. I have two questions for him. How do you imagine it is possible for the VA to function to address the needs of the greater American healthcare? That's question number one. And question number two is, can the LAVC help to connect the VA to the greater American health system?
Did you say help or health?
Health, like healthcare.
Well, so, I mean, these are two different systems, right? I mean, there are three, I always talk about this, there are three main health systems in America, right? What are they? Well, there's the military healthcare system for active duty folks and their families, right? Then there's the VA healthcare system. And then there's the private insurance healthcare system, which is how most Americans get their care. The first two healthcare systems really are national healthcare, right? It's socialized healthcare. I know socialism is a bad word in America, and we shouldn't be saying that, but healthcare in the military and the VA, these are social healthcare systems. They're provided as part of either an occupation, the military, or as part of having served in the military, that's the VA. These other systems are really they're private or for-profit, even the ones that are nonprofit hospitals have to raise money to continue. And so healthcare reimbursables becomes a huge, huge issue. And I will tell you, smarter people than I have looked at this issue, Lewis, and have not been able to solve it. So I'm not going to sit here today and say, here's the solution. Obviously, the military healthcare system for the active duty folks and the VA healthcare system are extremely expensive. And I don't think you can actually duplicate those nationwide without a huge, huge increase in resources to the national healthcare, to the civilian healthcare system. There's lots of op-ed pieces being written now about how our national healthcare system failed, to respond to corona, and all of these things. But I would just say that I'm not smart enough to solve that. It's very, very complex, and it would really require a complete cultural change in order to bring that about. And Eva, what was the second part of Lewis's question?
Can the LAVC help to connect the VA to the greater American health system?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think the LAVC shows you what can happen at the community level, right? I mean, you could have a collaboration for all of these agencies, right? For all of the agencies that serve various populations. So there's nothing that prevents that from happening other than having this organizing framework. But there are some costs associated with organizing, like the collaborative. There's costs associated with doing that. And it's minimal in the big picture of things. And I think in the tremendous synergy and third and fourth order effects that are generated by the collaborative. I think it pays for itself in like a week in terms of lessons learned and identifying gaps and keeping ahead of, emerging issues, because it's folks who are on the front line, like members of the collaborative, who see these issues before they become big issues. And collaboratives allow for that rapid responding to issues before they become major issues. So I hope that began to answer your question, Liz, but I know it didn't answer your question because I don't have an answer to certainly that first question.
All right.
So the next question is, does the coronavirus pandemic allow us an opportunity to identify weaknesses in how healthcare is delivered?
Absolutely it does, right? Absolutely it does. And I think what one of the things in the military that we always talk about, and I always think about, like when I'm back on the military, I think of chaos as opportunity, right? Because, when there's chaos, that means nobody really knows what's going on. But if you can get a plan together and implement it, you can actually take advantage of chaos. And so there are just certain things that, I mentioned one already, that it forced us into telehealth, right? Whether we wanted to do it or not. It forced us to work from home, whether we wanted to do it or not, right? We're beginning to see all the things we can do from home that we said absolutely couldn't be done from home, actually can be done from home, right? So that's a plus. I think another thing that we could do, the country has talked about, for example, national support for preschool. And so mothers could go back to work, so single dads could go back to work. So this is a time to do that. All the preschools and daycares are shut. Now's the time to think about what that could look like post-pandemic and get those and start building those and get those in place. We also realize that those folks who are vulnerable in the best of times are the most vulnerable in the worst of times. And we're seeing that, right? We're seeing that among the African-American communities, and we're seeing that among other disadvantaged communities as well. So that is just exposing the faults that we already knew existed, but it helps us refocus again to addressing those. So yes, this pandemic is showing us where we have our faults, and I'm not talking about screening capacity and PPE. We know all of those already, but I'm really talking about things that are societal and that we can address if we're just focused. What I thought was amazing was how homelessness was immediately addressed. We're going to close all the rec centers in the county and the city, and there'll be a bed for every homeless person in LA. Although, I've been driving around LA just to get out of the house. I don't get out of my car, but I kind of just drive around. And I see lots of homeless tents and stuff back up where they always were. And so there's something about these rec center setups that the homeless folks don't like. I don't know what that is. I've got a colleague who's looking at this. He doesn't have answers yet. I asked him yesterday in preparation for this, hey, what are we doing for the homeless? Because I know there's a lot of homeless vets. I see homeless tents and camps popping up again where they were before, because I go all around LA and interact with a lot of them. And so I know that there's something about those rec center setups they did. Like you all, probably someone on this phone call, this webinar knows more about what they don't like than I do. But I know there's something they don't like about it because they're leaving. And I also heard some stories in Dallas where they put all of the homeless folks up into a convention center.
Out again.
Am I down?
Oh, there we go. Now you're back up.
Okay, and police started doing ID checks and arresting any homeless people who had a warrant out for their arrest. I said, well, who does that, right? Who does that during a pandemic, takes advantage of, oh, they're all coming here, let's just see who we can arrest and put in jail. So that word quickly spread. So a lot of the homeless folks, well, I'm not going to go there. So these are just things that it's just bad policy and bad processes that were put in place, I think. If the idea was to help the homeless versus let's arrest the ones who have warrants for them, there are mechanisms to do that. I don't think you do that during a pandemic. I just think some things you wait on. But maybe I'm in the minority there. I just don't think that's what we should be doing to veterans when they're showing up for care, also checking their ID and arresting them and throwing them in jail, because that's really going to prevent us from really helping them.
Okay. The next question I have that's popping up in the top is from Jennifer Lynn. Good morning, everyone. Finding a job during this time can be stressful, especially if people are quickly approaching graduation. Is there a good time for the U.S. Vets Career Development Initiative to connect with veterans currently enrolled to help them find a job? What would be the best way to go about connecting with the U.S. veteran graduates?
Wow, what a great question. It's something that we're looking at very seriously here, because you're absolutely right. This is the worst time to be trying to find a job when a lot of places are shut. And it's certainly, depending on where you live, going to be almost impossible to start a job depending on where you live. I would say connect now and often. I don't think we have enough resources. One of the things we're thinking about, we have a lot of veterans who are graduating, where are they going to be able to get a job if places are shut? What are they going to do? How are they going to pay bills and all of these things? So we need to be on this like now. And I think employment, I kind of started off with employment because we know that younger veterans, at least the data that's coming out of the Department of Labor, shows that younger veterans have a higher unemployment, or being affected greater than their age-matched civilian counterparts. All right, our younger veterans are. And here I'm talking, 24 to 30 to 34. So in that age range. And we gotta kind of have to redouble our efforts. I mean, let's not forget that, 10, 12, 13 years ago, when veterans were coming out of the military in the first few years of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, unemployment rate was really, really high for them. And it took 5 or 6, 7 years of a hard work by a lot of people to bring that rate down to where it actually was below their civilian counterparts. But now, for those young groups we're seeing now, they're being disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus. So we need to start now. And it's never too early. It's never too early to start now, and full court pressure on employment, because that's so fundamentally important to the well-being, not only of veterans, but of all Americans.
Okay, and we have time to address one more question before we're going to go to one of our panelists, Tesbanko, to share some information. So the next question is, do you think that implementing mental health while in active duty after deployments can address mental health prior to discharge from the military? I got out in 2005, so not sure if this is being done now. Does anyone know if this is something that is now used? And this is from Laura Henderson.
So, one of the things, and I haven't talked about this a lot, I keep toying with writing about this a little bit, but I haven't. And so in 2005, I think that's when Eva said you left the military. So for the last 12, 13, 14 years, ever since, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, the strategy for how we take care of veterans shifted. It shifted from one before OIF, OEF. The strategy was, if a service member had PTSD, I'll just use that as the example. So PTSD is considered a severe mental health disorder. All right, that's what the D stands for. I know people want to drop off the D and call it PTS, but I'm talking specifically PTSD. You were separated from the military. If you got a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, you were separated. So the strategy was assess, diagnose, separate. Okay, that was the strategy. In around 2002, President Bush decided, no, we're going to treat service members with PTSD and let them remain on active duty. So that was a fundamental shift in strategy. And the military really wasn't prepared for it, right? So if the strategy was assess, diagnose, separate, And the new strategy basically became assess, diagnose, treat, return to duty. You need a different set of clinicians and a different set of clinical expertise, right? If now all of a sudden I have to treat you, that's very different than diagnosing you and doing the paperwork to separate you, okay? So in 2005, for sure, it was about assess, diagnose, treat, return to duty. In the last 2 years, under Secretary Mattis, and I don't know, Mattis is a very entertaining speaker and, great American and blah, blah, blah. But he changed that strategy back to assess, diagnose, separate, okay? So his view is if you can't deploy, if you're non-deployable for more than a year, now you could say, well, you can treat PTSD in less than a year and return someone to duty. Maybe you can. But if you can't, you're separated. If you have a physical injury that takes more than a year to recover from, you're separated. So that was a fundamental shift back to pre-OIF, OEF healthcare. And so soldier, and this is a long-winded way to get to your specific question, and I apologize, but I wanted to give the context of that. So what that has resulted in is many service members now not coming forward. And certainly if you are suicidal, you're almost for certain going to be separated from the military. That doesn't mean you're not going to get care and treatment while you're going through that separation board process, but you are going on the separation pathway. It's very early still, so we don't know how that's going to play out, but it's going to place a greater burden on the VA for sure, and on everyone in the collaborative who supports veterans. It's going to increase their workload because it's not like someone's going to get all the care they need while they're on active duty. And then when they come off active duty, they're going to be fine and go back into society and contribute. Many of them are going to come off active duty, still requiring care, will be transferred to the VA, and will require a lot of support, et cetera, in that whole transition from the military back to civilian life. So, and you asked a very simple question. I know I gave you a very complicated answer because I think it is complicated. If you have an issue that can be rapidly addressed, then you can remain on active duty and have those issues addressed and still have a career. But if you have an issue that's lingering, whether it's mental health or physical health, it's not singled out, then you're separated. So these permanent profiles, if you're non-deployable permanently, you're separated. And so that's a new strategy that was put in place and is continuing. And I'm just hearing anecdotal stories about it now, but it's going to be a significant challenge for communities who are receiving these veterans and caring for them, et cetera. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, Carl, for speaking today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm happy to come back anytime. If folks found this valuable, I'm happy to come back and answer more questions and share just things that are ongoing in the center. So just let me know whatever I can do to be part of sharing information and sharing ideas. And again, I want to hear ideas from you as well. So if you have ideas, please send them to Giselle, who will send them to me, or send them directly to me. I'd love to hear from you because I think we're going to be responding to the impact of this pandemic for the next 10 years easy. So even once we all go back to work, we're going to still be dealing with the long-term downstream effects of what's happening today. And we all know that because we live the space. We live in that space. We deal with combat, and combat doesn't, the problems with our veterans and service members don't end when the fighting stops. It continues for the next 20 years, if not longer. And we're going to see something very similar in this situation as well. So, this is going to have a long impact, long-term impact. So again, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. So we have a brief announcement by Tess Benko. Go ahead, Tess. You got the floor. Stop my
Hey,
video.
LA Collaborative. I hope everybody's hanging in there and doing well, even in the midst of the crisis. I'm Tess Banco. Many of you know me. I'm the Access and Engagement co-chair, along with Gabriel Santos from BOA. You know, Access and Engagement group is about accessibility of resources, wayfinding, and also encouraging quality metrics. And this isn't just for the individual veterans that we serve. This is also for the VSOs that are serving veterans. So to that end, a survey has been created. It's called the LA County VSO Needs Survey. And really what it's intended to do is to survey the veteran and family serving organization landscape for current needs and projected impacts after this COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll place the survey link into the chat box. But really what it's going to help do is assist in helping the wider LA community become aware of veteran and family specific needs, and also identify the best ways for potentially funders and other organizations to support our very vital organizations. So please click on the link, and if you can complete it as soon as possible. It's very important to get this information into the hands of those who may be able to assist with funding and other types of suggestions. So thank you very much for having me, and please in the chat box, let me know if there's any questions.
All right, everyone, thank you for joining us. I'm sorry, and thank you for joining us. We've sent out an email. It also includes the link to the survey that Tess just mentioned, and it also includes the link to the meeting agenda. In that, once you download the meeting agenda, you'll be able to access the different working group links. So please make sure to download the meeting agenda. I just resent the link to everyone. Please go ahead and read that email, download the agenda, and we'll see you soon in all the workout groups. Bye. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you all next month.